For years, André Rieu has been the gentle pulse of a quieter world. The man whose violin didn't just play music, but stitched shattered hearts back together and made even the loneliest souls feel seen. His waltzes floated across time like threads of silver light, soft enough to soothe pain, yet strong enough to awaken joy. Crowds once stood beneath the warm night skies of Maastricht, laughing and crying all at once as his bow glided with effortless grace. But the smile the world adored was hiding a battle no applause could drown. In recent years, André has faced a silent enemy, a condition that shakes his balance and threatens the very stage that defined him. Dizziness, fatigue, and the constant fear that a single misstep could end the concert forever haunt every performance. What the world sees as elegance is now an ongoing fight to remain upright, present, and unbroken. And yet, he plays. He plays because the music is not just art, it is the lifeline that has carried him through a childhood where love was scarce, where affection was replaced by discipline, silence, and expectation. Born in post-war Maastricht, in a house polished like a museum but empty of warmth, André learned early that applause can be loud but love is quiet. His father could command the awe of an orchestra, but never shared a single affectionate word with his son. His mother kept everything perfect, except the space a child needs to feel held. So at 6, André found comfort in a violin larger than his arms, practicing in cold rooms long after everyone else slept, playing not for excellence, but for survival. The violin listened when no one else did. It became his closest companion, the only place where his heart could speak. Years later, at the Royal Conservatory in Brussels, he endured praise for technique, but punishment for passion. Emotion was considered weakness. Warmth was considered childish. Yet he dreamed of an orchestra that could make people feel again, that could smile, sway, and remind the world that beauty is not a performance, but an experience. And so, at 29, with no approval, no financial backing, and no guarantee of success, he formed his first small orchestra in a quiet rehearsal room in Maastricht, an act of rebellion carried out with a bow instead of a weapon, and with hope instead of permission. The first concerts were small, held in drafty halls where the air was cold but the laughter was real. Those rooms may not have held grandeur, but they held something far more precious, warmth. And at André's side through it all was Marjorie, the woman who believed in him long before the world had any reason to. Their love did not come easily. His mother disapproved, rejected the marriage outright, and in doing so, severed the final cord that tied André to the home that had shaped his loneliness. It felt like losing a part of myself, he would later say, not in anger but in quiet grief. But in that loss came something unexpected. Freedom. The last echo of seeking approval went silent. He no longer lived to be seen, he lived to create. The pain that once silenced him became the furnace that forged his independence. And when he stepped onto those small echoing stages with his tiny orchestra, he wasn't just performing, he was mending the world one note at a time. I was not born in warmth, he once said, but I chose to build it. And slowly, note by trembling note, he began to rewrite what classical music meant. It was no longer just sound, it became shelter, a place where even sorrow could breathe. By 1987, worn down by years of rejection, empty pockets, and dreams that seemed too fragile to protect, André stood on the edge of a decision that would define his life. At 38, while others were settling into certainty, he was preparing to start again. His hands, once small and shaking from cold practice rooms, now held a dream that still trembled, not because it was weak, but because it was alive. He formed the Johann Strauss Orchestra with only 12 musicians, a dream so bold that the classical establishment laughed outright. They mocked him for wanting to make classical music smile, to return joy to something they believed should remain frozen in tradition. But André knew what he was chasing, not perfection, connection. They said I was foolish, he would later say, with a quiet, tired smile, but I would rather be foolish with joy than die with discipline. Those early years were not romantic, they were brutal. Money came slowly, like hesitant applause, never enough to rest, barely enough to continue. Every concert was a gamble, every tour felt like the final one. André sold possessions, borrowed what he could, repaid what he couldn't, and kept moving. Some nights his fingers grew numb from cold. Some nights he played on an empty stomach so that his musicians, the family he chose, would never know hunger. Fatigue began to follow him like a shadow. Dizziness flickered at the edges of his vision. His hands sometimes trembled after rehearsals that lasted deep into the night. Still, the bow never slipped. Still, he stood. There were moments, he admitted, when the stage swayed under me and I thought I might fall, but the music held me upright. January 1988. 12 musicians, one dream, a hall full of strangers who did not yet know they were witnessing the start of something holy. The performance soared, the applause crashed like thunder, but backstage, when the curtain fell, André sat alone, trembling, shoulders heavy, eyes burning with exhaustion, and the account still dripping red ink. Applause, he realized, does not pay debts. It only tells you that the dream is working, even when the world around it is falling apart. There were nights he returned to cold hotel rooms with barely a coat to warm him, whispering to himself, just one more concert, one more miracle. Once, under a dim lamp, he counted coins for hours, deciding between repairing a broken violin string or eating dinner. His body protested, but his soul would not yield. He told himself, if I must fall, let it be on stage. Let me fall inside the music. And when the lights rose, the audience didn't see a man fighting to stay upright. They saw joy. They saw love. They saw life. Looking back decades later, André does not recall the fear, nor the hunger, nor the cold. He remembers the faces, the smiles that bloomed when the music began, and in that memory, every bruise became a blessing. The seeds of joy he planted in those years would soon burst into bloom. But what neither he nor the world knew then was that the faint dizziness that haunted him in those early concerts was not exhaustion alone. It was the first whisper of a hidden illness, one that would one day threaten to silence him entirely. Yet he played on, because for André Rieu, joy was never the absence of suffering. Joy was what survived it. His performance had crossed continents, stadiums, plazas, opera halls blooming to the sound of his violin. The world saw the glittering lights, the standing ovations, the sea of faces rising to applaud the man who made them believe in beauty again. But what they did not see was the price carved into his body. That iconic performance, the one that launched him into global legend, came after nights where he barely slept, where anxiety tangled with exhaustion, where every rehearsal had to be perfect because failure meant collapse. That night changed everything, André reflected. But it also began the hardest battle of my life, to keep the music alive without losing myself to it. From that moment forward, life became motion, airports, hotels, rehearsal rooms, faces he could barely remember. He was not just a violinist anymore. He was a leader, a caretaker, the pillar holding up an entire family of musicians. He was the artist, yes, but also the financier, the organizer, the problem solver, the one responsible for flights, salaries, schedules, insurance, repairs, visas, costumes, every detail of a global orchestra. People called him the king of the waltz. But a crown is not always glory. Sometimes it is weight. On stage, he smiled as if joy flowed through him like sunlight. Off stage, he leaned against dressing room walls, catching his breath while the world waited for the next song. There were nights when the stage lights blurred, when his bow arm felt numb, but he refused to let the audience see the tremor of fatigue. There were evenings, he confessed, when I bowed and I could barely feel my arms, but the audience lifted me up simply by listening. By the early 2000s, André had built something nearly unheard of in the modern world, an independent musical empire. His orchestra wasn't just a group of musicians, it was a community. He constructed his own recording studio in Maastricht to protect the purity of his sound. Every concert was handcrafted, every detail shaped to preserve connection over spectacle. Each decision was a risk, balanced like a fragile violin string. Some risks blossomed, others almost destroyed him. Then came 2009 illness, exhaustion, and sudden cancellations spiraled into a financial nightmare. More than $15 million evaporated in months. Many artists would have walked away, but not André. I didn't lie awake worrying about myself, he said. I worried about the hundreds of families who relied on me to survive. His wealth, his properties, more than 80 in Maastricht, were not trophies. They were protection, homes for staff, warehouses for instruments, safe places to hold the music when the world became unstable. His touring trucks crossed borders carrying priceless violins. His chefs prepared food to keep musicians healthy. He even built a nursery so mothers would never have to choose between music and children. My orchestra is my family, André said quietly. And you do not abandon family. To the world, his concerts glittered, gowns flowing under starlight, waltzes drifting like perfume into summer air. But behind the scenes were swollen fingers, sleepless nights, quiet breakdowns, and ledger sheets marked by hope rather than guarantee. His wealth was vast, yes, his house a castle, yes, but none of it was excess. It was armor, it was shelter, it was preservation. Everything he built to keep the music alive. The castle in Maastricht was his sanctuary long before it became his home. He first saw it as a child, a quiet, majestic monument filled with the echo of footsteps and distant laughter. When he finally bought it in 1999, it was not an act of triumph. It was a declaration of survival. I needed a place, he said, where the world could not reach my heart. Restoring the castle became a kind of healing. Each restored wall rewrote a memory. Each revived garden returned breath to a chest that had been tight for years. It was no longer stone. It was a heartbeat. In the sunlit conservatory, he found warmth. In the lush garden, he found air. In the recording studio, he found silence that did not judge him. On days when his balance faltered, when the illness whispered that the ground might vanish beneath him, he walked into the castle chapel with his violin, lifted the bow, and let the music carry his trembling body into stillness. Silence, he once said, can wound you, but it can also heal you, and through it all, he never stopped playing. The castle's quiet halls became his shelter when his own body could no longer keep its balance, and within those walls rested two of his most sacred companions, two Stradivarius violins, one born in 1667 and the other in 1732. Their wood carried the fingerprints of centuries, their tone the breath of time itself. To most, they were priceless antiques. To André Rieu, they were living pulse and memory, extensions of his chest, his lungs, his very heartbeat. When I play them, he once said, I feel history breathing through me. But even these treasures were drawn into his struggle. When the world came to a standstill in 2020, overnight stages went dark, tours evaporated, applause became a memory. The music that had once filled cathedrals and city squares fell into a stillness so heavy it seemed the world itself had forgotten how to feel. Yet André's first fear was not for himself, but for the 100 lives that depended on his orchestra to survive. The violinists, the cellists, the drivers, the tailors, the stagehands, people who had crossed oceans and decades with him. As concert cancellations multiplied and revenue collapsed, he emptied the reserves he had built over a lifetime. Months passed, savings drained, and then came the moment he never imagined. He stood before his 1732 Stradivarius, the violin that had held his joy, his grief, his childhood scars, and he whispered to himself that if selling it meant his orchestra could stay whole, he would let it go. It would have been like cutting out a part of my soul, he later confessed, but still, he never sold it. Somehow, the music endured. To onlookers, the castle and the violins symbolized luxury. To him, they were proof of survival, a body and spirit that refused to collapse even when silence tried to undo them. The castle was where his lungs could rest when breathing felt heavy. The violins were where his heart continued to sing when his hands trembled. Even the finest instruments, he once murmured, must be tuned again and again, just like the human heart. But nothing could prepare him for the silence of that year. For decades, his life had followed the rhythm of endless movement, rehearsals, airports, performances, the heartbeat of applause. And suddenly it all stopped. The world fell silent, and so did he. The sudden stillness felt like a surgeon's blade. Quiet, sharp, merciless. The applause that had always lifted him vanished, replaced by rooms that echoed only with memory. Yet he still thought not of himself, but of the lives his music sustained. To protect them, he sold his vintage car, shares of investments, small pieces of the life he had built, quiet sacrifices no one saw. On the darkest nights, the silence inside the castle felt endless. He would walk its corridors alone, hearing past laughter where only shadows now rested. And when the weight of stillness grew too great, he retreated to his studio, lifted his violin, and played, not to be heard but to stay alive. When the music stops, he reflected, you learn what it truly means. The melodies he composed in that year were slower, deeper, shaped by gratitude and grief, not performances, prayers. So when the world opened its doors again, and he stepped onto a stage for the first time in over a year, the moment was not triumph. It was resurrection. The audience did not roar. They breathed, they wept, they rose for a man who had carried the weight of silence and returned with music still inside him. What stood beneath the lights that night was no longer simply the king of the waltz, but a man who had walked through stillness, held on to hope with trembling hands, and learned once more how to make the world dance. There comes a silence in a musician's life that has nothing to do with the audience, a silence that rises from inside the body itself. For André Rieu, that silence struck like lightning. Years of touring, endless time zones, sleepless flights, and performances that demanded more of the soul than the body could afford finally caught him. A sudden inner ear illness shattered his sense of balance, as if the floor had become an ocean that moved beneath his feet. The maestro who once led orchestras with effortless grace now held the walls just to stay upright. Concerts planned months ahead were canceled one after another. The world saw announcements, refunds, apologies. What they didn't see was André, in the stillness of his home, gripping doorframes, walking hallways in the dark, telling himself over and over, I have to return, they are waiting for me. Each step became an act of will, each breath a negotiation with dizziness and then nausea. His hands, once steady as moonlight, trembled, and yet he refused to surrender. In that forced quiet, he learned that courage doesn't roar. Sometimes, it barely whispers. Just when his body began to recover, fate shifted its blade. In 2016, his closest companion on stage, Ruud Merckx, the trombonist who had been with him through decades of triumph and exhaustion, collapsed at the middle of a tour. Just hours before, their dressing room had been filled with jokes, stories, and the warmth of a friendship forged under stage lights. Then suddenly, silence. A silence heavier than any illness. That night, André walked on stage as he always had, but the music sounded different. Every waltz felt like a farewell. Every pause in the score held a grief words could not hold. From that day forward, he left a single moment of stillness in his performances. No announcement, no explanation, just a breath for the friend who would never return. Loss settled into his music like a shadow, but also like a prayer. And just when he believed he had learned to carry both grief and music, another storm arrived. In 2024, during a massive concert in Mexico, as 40,000 hearts waited for the first note, his world tilted, light exploded behind his eyes, the stage lunged toward him, the violin nearly slipped from his hand, voices blurred, he was rushed away, faces swirling above him like reflections in broken glass. The hotel that night felt impossibly quiet, messages from the world blinked unanswered on his phone. He lay there wondering if his final bow had already been taken, but when morning came, he rose, slowly, carefully, painfully, because for him, music was not performance, it was breath. Recovery was slow and merciless. Some days his hands could manage only a few minutes of playing before the world spun again, but those few minutes became victories. His concerts grew shorter, his rehearsals gentler, his touch on strings softer, not from weakness, but from understanding. He no longer played to impress, he played to remain alive. And in that fragile return, something extraordinary happened. His music deepened, not louder, not grander, but truer. Every note carried not skill, but survival. Every waltz was a heartbeat refusing to stop, and audiences felt it. Today, when André steps under lights, his bow trembles not from fear, but from memory. He plays for the child who once sought warmth and sound, for the friend now gone, for the body that fought to keep him upright, for every soul who ever needed music to keep breathing. And the world, listening, understands his greatest masterpiece was not a performance, it was the courage to continue. Marjorie has always been the quiet force behind André Rieu's dazzling world, the steady heartbeat behind the shimmering waltzes and the crowded concert halls. While the world saw gowns, lights, and applause, she was the one carrying the weight of reality, managing tours, shielding André when exhaustion threatened to break him, and rebuilding the pieces when illness forced the music to pause. She handled contracts, budgets, schedules, health emergencies, setbacks, never for applause, never for recognition, but because love, real love, is work done in silence. André once said softly, "If people call me the king of the waltz, then she is the one who keeps the crown from slipping." Their son, Pierre, grew up not on playgrounds but backstage, sleeping on instrument cases and waking to sound checks. He learned early that legacy is not formed on stage, but behind it. Now he stands guard over his father's life and work, adjusting rehearsal length, lighting levels, travel timing, protecting the same hands that once played through childhood loneliness. When the cheering stops, Pierre once said, "That's when I make sure my father is okay." And then there is Daisy, the granddaughter whose small fingers now tap piano keys with the same wonder André once held at age 6. Her laughter fills the castle halls that once echoed only discipline and ambition. To André, she is not simply family. She is proof that love, when nurtured, grows new wings across generations. The music has chosen her, he whispered once, watching her play. Today, in late 2025, André lives quietly in his 150-year-old home near the castle that shaped him. The grandeur remains, but the pace has softened. His mornings begin with slow walks through mist-covered gardens, guided carefully to preserve balance and strength. Meals are prepared with care, rehearsals paced with kindness, and the violin is no longer a demand, but a conversation. Evenings belong to family. No crowds, no spotlights, just soft voices, warm rooms, and the peace of being loved for the man, not the legend. And while he has never spoken of inheritance, his family already knows. His true legacy is not money, not property, not even his priceless Stradivarius violins. It is the courage to create warmth where none existed before, the devotion to keep going when the body faltered, the grace to choose gentleness in a world that applauds spectacle. People speak of his wealth in millions, but his real wealth is measured in the hearts he held through music. The summer concerts of 2025 are still remembered, the final note hanging under an open sky, thousands holding their breath as if afraid to exhale. Backstage, Andre whispered, "I am still here," and so is the music. Now, his body is slower, his concerts fewer, but every note he plays carries more truth than ever before. He no longer performs to fill auditoriums, he performs to remind the world, and himself, that beauty survives, that joy returns, that tenderness can be stronger than pain. If Andre's music has ever carried you through a hard hour, softened your grief, or reminded you that you are not alone, leave a word for him below. Your gratitude is a living part of his symphony. And as you breathe tonight, remember this: there is still music left in you too. Your heart can dance again, your story is not finished, and like André Rieu, you are still here.